Welcome to Moneyweb at Midday, the actuality news show, offering unique insights and in-depth analysis featuring South Africa's top business leaders, newsmakers, and analysts for today's professionals. Your host, Jeremy Maggs.
Hello, and thank you for listening to Moneyweb at Midday. In the next 30 minutes, I'll put some context around the numbers, perspective around the politics, and clarity around the choices facing us in South Africa. A warm welcome. I'm Jeremy Maggs. Coming up on the program today, can Africa turn its population boom into lasting prosperity and global influence? MTN's former chief executive officer speaks out. The Constitutional Court battle that could redraw the boundaries of property rights. South Africa's news media shake-up and the view from a key industry player. And just 4 years to act before the world misses a critical deadline for ocean protection. It's Wednesday, the 5th of August.
By 2050, 1 in every 4 people on the planet is expected to be African. That extraordinary population growth could give the continent far greater economic, cultural and political influence. But without jobs, without education, without functioning institutions and deeper economic integration, it could also intensify equality, migration and instability. In his new book, it's called The Invisible People, former MTN chief executive Phuthuma Nhleko argues that Africa remains largely invisible in the global economy and in many of the institutions where international power is exercised. He goes on to say that the continent needs a new renaissance, built, he says, on a stronger sense of identity, of greater economic cooperation, technological innovation, and a more confident collective voice. So I want to explore that in a lot more detail. Phuthuma Nhleko, a very warm welcome to you. Maybe let's start with a contextual question, if I can, and it's in the title. Who are the invisible people, but more importantly, invisible to whom?
Well, the invisibility is, as I put it in the book, it's the invisibility to the rest of the world. You know, I feel that Africa is, in many respects, on a number of matters and areas, whether it's commerce, whether it's geopolitics and so on. We're very much on the periphery. So we are invisible to a great part of the world, but in many respects, we're also invisible to ourselves, in the sense that there has been a huge detachment between the historical line of Africans, their history, their contributions, and how they see themselves today. So it's a double invisibility, if you like. And I think that's where I speak to somebody like W.E. Du Bois, who really explains this concept, I think, quite masterfully.
I'm wondering if Africa is invisible because the world then chooses not to see us, or do you think it's because the continent has failed to project not only its power, but also its potential?
Yeah, it's really the latter. I think the days of victimhood are gone. They are passé. Of course, the world sees you to the extent you want to be seen. So we all know the tragic historical history, certainly of the last 500 years, 600 years. But we are in a position now to assert ourselves. We're in a position to leverage the population dividend, which of course can become a liability if we don't have some of the foundational pillars that I spoke about. So really it's up to us to leverage it. So it's more the latter in what you've described, is that we need to be on the front foot. We need to begin to engage in long-range planning, and we really need to move forward in a manner that is in our self-enlightened interest. So that's the way that I see that.
It's interesting that you reference the date 2050. As I said in my introduction, roughly a quarter of the world's population could be African. Why, Phuthuma, is that statistic so central to the book?
Well, that statistic is, there's nothing absolutely magical about it. I mean, apart from the fact that it is half century, And if you look at or review a lot of stats from, a whole range of institutions, including the United Nations and so on, that's when we expect to have a really fundamental pivot on the demographics of many countries. So I would say that, that's when, for instance, you'd expect by around 2042 that the composition of the African American demographics or American demographics would be majority black and brown. That's by when you would expect that, almost 50% of the youth under 18 years of age would be on this continent. So it does point to that date, but there's nothing absolutely magic about it. It could be 2040 and so on, but I just think 2050 is actually quite an important marker.
All right, let me follow up on that then. What happens if the continent reaches that point without, as you've suggested in the book, creating enough jobs, industries, and functioning cities?
Then we've got, we are really on the path to a ticking time bomb, aren't we? Because the essence of the thesis of the book is that the rate at which this population is growing, if you look at that trend, and you look at the trend that would describe the amount of capacity to be provided in food, health, education, and so on, that trend, albeit rising, is rising very, very gradually. So that divergence is really what describes the huge danger that we face if we don't have those institutions and that capacity and those pillars in place. In fact, I describe in the book that, every time you watch television these days, you often see huge migration across the Sahel and across the Mediterranean into Europe. That is really a drop in the ocean. If these pillars are not put in place, that capacity is not put in place, that ensures that the needs of those millions and millions of people are addressed on the African continent. Even Europe will not have the luxury to turn a blind eye to this because they will be hugely impacted. And we're seeing that already. So I think the simple answer to your very simple question is if those things are not put in place, we then have enormous socioeconomic tensions that will engulf everybody, including Europe in particular.
Phuthuma, let me push you a little further on Africa's population growth then. In the book itself, you describe it as a potential source of strength. Obviously, a lot of other people would view it as a looming crisis. How narrow then do you think that window is in which governments need to act quickly? And you referenced long-range planning. Do we have the luxury of long-range planning in this respect?
Well, it's an imperative. And let me start off by saying that it is a dividend, it is a potential source of strength. But that source of strength can very rapidly turn into a huge problem and a huge liability. So that's what I'm saying. With respect to do we have the luxury? No, we don't. It's an imperative. I would say on a timeline, we need to, in the next sort of 5 years, start making some very, very decisive actions as far as preparing for this bulge. Because the other complexity that we have is the fact that technology change is accelerating. Technology is changing at a faster and faster and faster pace. So if you're in China, it was 1949, you had more of a luxury of time to plan for what we're seeing in China today. We have less of that luxury because of technology. There are many indications that almost 30%, for instance, of the relatively unskilled workforce in the United States will be out of a job in 3 years, right? And that's a highly developed country, right?
Yeah.
So can you imagine what it means for the African countries where some are still even trying to emerge out of, the second and third industrial revolution, let alone the fourth, or entering the fourth. So the timeline is limited. I would say the window of 5 years, primarily because of technological change, is the kind of time window that we have. If we don't act within that window, I think the African continent will then be left behind even more substantially than it is today.
In conversation there with Phuthuma Nhleko, who's the author of the book The Invisible People. He's also former Chief Executive Officer of MTN. The full interview can be seen on Moneyweb TV on moneyweb.co.za.
Moneyweb at midday for all your up-to-date stories.
You'll be well aware that South Africa's Expropriation Act is facing a decisive constitutional test. The Democratic Alliance is arguing that the law was unlawfully passed by the National Council of Provinces and contains contradictory provisions governing compensation disputes. Other applicants are challenging the circumstances in which land may be taken for nil compensation. Now, as I understand it, the DA wants the entire act declared invalid, potentially forcing Parliament back to the drawing board and reopening the national argument, the discussion over property rights, land reform and investment certainty. Well, let's discuss this in a little more detail. I'm in conversation now with Bulelwa Mabasa, who's Director and Head of Land Reform at Worksman's Attorneys. Bulelwa, a very warm welcome. Let's get straight to it. The Expropriation Act, is it genuinely unconstitutional in your opinion, or is the DA asking the court to settle a political battle that it lost in Parliament?
Jeremy, it's a bit of a tricky question. I think the first remark I'd like to make is that we already have an Expropriation Act that has been the act that's been implemented for the last over 40 years, which is the 1975 Expropriation Act. So expropriation has been part and parcel of our law. It's not a new concept. It's internationally recognized. That's the first thing. The second thing I'd like to say is where parts of it may be unconstitutional or where it may be argued is now the introduction of the concept of expropriation without compensation. Now, that concept is new. That has not been a concept that has been known in our law. However, the new act introduces, I'd like to say, finite or 4 circumstances where EWC could happen. EWC, expropriation without compensation, can happen. And those are where land is abandoned or where land has been held for speculative purposes. It hasn't been operated or been used, or where the state itself owns land, but it doesn't need it for purposes of its state administration. And where, for example, there's a piece of land, the landowner is unknown, nobody has been paying rates and taxes, and the land value is less than the indebtedness of the rates and taxes. So it's really a very finite number of circumstances. But the argument that has been made is the wording in that section, which is section 12, has words such as including but not limited to, which then the argument goes may extend the circumstances under which expropriation without compensation couldn't happen. And I think also a fundamental argument is that the EWC concept should not be constitutional for whatever reason. So I think it's important to create that distinction, that the argument is that our constitution currently must be subject to just and equitable compensation. And the introduction of an EWC concept is one that is not constitutional. So it's not the case that the entire act, in my view, is unconstitutional. That depends on what argument passes in court. So the DA argument, why they're saying the entire act is unconstitutional, they're relying on some provincial mandates where they're saying the NCOP process was not procedurally correct. And if they are right, then the entire act will fall because the procedure that led to it being introduced in Parliament would have been unlawful. However, if the questions are around whether or not expropriation without compensation is allowed, then the act may survive. And what the courts usually do is they read in wording into an act in order to kind of give it some level of survival. And the courts don't like to interfere with Parliament's work. It's also possible that the court will say, Parliament, we're giving you 24 months or 48 months to fix this. If there is parts of the act that are unlawful, they may be given an opportunity to rectify those.
So key to this issue then is how strong the claim is that the NCOP approved legislation without those valid provincial mandates, which are required by the Constitution.
Yes, that is the one. The other argument is that Section 12 in its entirety, they say, should not be part of the Act. So there shouldn't be any circumstances under which expropriation without compensation couldn't happen. There's a third leg, Jeremy, as well. And that is that there's a provision in the Act that says, let's say I'm being the expropriation party and you're the state. Between myself and the state, we're busy negotiating why I'm fighting why the expropriation shouldn't happen, or that I'm fighting the issue of compensation. The current framing of the Act says that the expropriation continues whilst I'm still in mediation or I'm still in an arbitration with the state around the legality of the expropriation itself or the compensation. So that's a provision in Section 19. The argument along there is that you can't have a situation where I've received a notice of expropriation. I haven't yet exercised my rights. I haven't defended myself, and the process and the expropriation goes along anyway. So that's also one of the big issues. However, Jeremy, I think it's important to say whether it's Section 12 or Section 19 that's not perfect, that doesn't mean that the entire Act could be declared unconstitutional. There are provisions of this Act that are actually an improvement from the 1975 Act in the sense that it gives the expropriated party powers for mediation, for arbitration. It actually brings more hurdles for the state to expropriate than before.
So the fears that are being put out about ordinary homes, businesses and farms being arbitrarily seized and supported by wording of the Act, is that just politically exaggerated, do you think?
Absolutely. I think that's a misnomer because we still have guidance from Section 23 of the Constitution that tells us under what circumstances an expropriation should happen. You know, where the land is occupied, the land has people that are living on it or people that are working on it, or where the land itself is being worked on, either for agricultural purposes or farming purposes, it would not pass the test for an expropriation as defined in the Act and also as defined in the Section 25(3) of the Constitution.
Bulelwa, another argument the party is putting forward is that weaker property rights potentially damage investment and growth. I guess you've got to ask the question if there's hard evidence of that risk, or again, is that economic argument just speculative?
It is, first of all, Jeremy, there is no such right in South Africa. In South Africa, we have a constitutional provision that says no one may be deprived of their property arbitrarily. So this Act doesn't do that. It states under what circumstances expropriation must happen. It has to be in terms of the Constitution. So the idea that property rights are weakened by this Act is quite clearly incorrect. As I said, because we've always had an expropriation. An expropriation, Jeremy, is simply an ability by a state to utilize its power to acquire land or property when it needs it for a public purpose or in the public interest. Now that framing is worldwide, globally. In America, they call it eminent domain. In the UK, they call it acquisition. And so it's not a new concept that any investor of moment would be jittery about. And in fact, some argue that the fact that you have those four circumstances that are stated clearly that would lead to EWC, that is something of improving certainty for the investor to know that if they invest on land that is used, that is operated, where people are living and it's occupied, that it wouldn't be subject to expropriation.
I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed to Bulelwa Mabasa, who's Director and Head of Land Reform at Worksman's Attorneys.
You're listening to Moneyweb at Midday.
All right, let's move from the land issue now to media. And South Africa's news industry is again under renewed pressure. Media24 is restructuring as revenue falls and losses grow, while 17 former independent media titles are moving to a new operator amid questions about ownership and funding. Stili Charalambous is the co-founder and chief executive officer of the Daily Maverick and an important stakeholder in this ongoing and very difficult industry debate. Stili, a very warm welcome to you. Media24 says the advertising market is broken and that is forcing a restructure. Do you think it's market failure or management failure?
Hi, Jeremy, and good afternoon to all the listeners. It's a little bit of both, but I think mostly we can only respond to the market around us with management decisions. So the fact that the environment that we operate in is inhospitable to creating, especially public interest journalism, which can be very expensive and very costly and very lengthy to produce. And so when the market is that tough and it doesn't support the creation of that kind of journalism, you're forced into a corner. And when you're in an industry that has been struggling for as long as we have, it's very difficult to turn things around and to innovate your way out of a market failure.
And your own website as well, or your own company as well, you've cut costs, you've restructured. Have we reached a point, Stili, where all publishers are simply battling or failing to find a sustainable digital model?
It's pretty much across the board, Jeremy, and it's not just in South Africa, it's a global phenomenon. We're looking at a case now where there are exceptions to the rule. Even some of the biggest, most well-funded and historic news organizations around the world aren't able to break even. And I'm looking at the likes of the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, the Guardian. All of these are massive global organizations with global audiences, access to a lot of resources, technology resources, funders, and they still can't make it work. So, again, it's not just a case of can we be better? Of course we can be better and do better, but it's still an industry where only a few are able to survive.
But it's also about spending pressure, talking about survival. The companies might be battling to survive, but so are we. For instance, Stili, News24 has a paywall and a large audience. Others do as well. Does this current financial pressure, do you think, now suggest that we are just not prepared to pay enough for general news?
And it is a phenomenon that is more likely to play out in Africa, right? And in developing countries where we've got small economies, where we've got higher unemployment, where we have less propensity to pay. All those things contribute to not enough of the public being able to support. But what we are proposing is that when you look at all of this and you see this happening around you, this is where the state has to step in with a policy intervention. And that's the only way that you can restore a market failure. It's, what's happened in the banking industry before. The film industry gets rebates, although the department has been pretty poor in paying out those rebates. But there is precedent for policy interventions in different markets, and it's happened both locally and abroad.
So what would help in the immediate term then? Would it be a tax relief, subsidy, or an industry levy?
So what we need is a mixture of quite a few interventions because the problems are so broad. We are in quite a complex industry, and we need to build in some measure of controls to avoid bad actors benefiting and also avoiding dependencies on direct relationships with government grants and subsidies. So you can do that by using indirect subsidies. So, for example, when we get memberships and contributions from our readers, we pay VAT on that. Our recommendations are that should be zero rated, as should books, for example. Those payments should also be tax deductible in the hands of the public. If we want to get investors back into the industry, they should get investor allowances like the venture capital industry did when it was getting off the ground, and advertising rebates for advertisers to spend with Press Council registered publishers. So it's a wide variety, and we want to make sure that we avoid wastage. We want to avoid bad actors being rewarded and building some measure of control. And also, very importantly, is to stimulate local journalism where the brunt of this disruption has been felt in our cities and even hyperlocal journalism areas.
Stilly, just a final one. Your colleague Rebecca Davis today has really done an excellent job on the former independent media titles. I'd love your thoughts on whether you think this is genuinely new ownership or just the same network under a different structure.
Well, I think her article is quite clear that if we connect the dots, we can see how the timing of all this thing played out as the court rulings were being made against Sekunjalo. And so, on the face of it, it looks like things are being moved out to avoid the judgment and the payment of that loan plus the interest that was that accrued on that outstanding loan. So that's what it looks like to me as a sort of a reader of that great piece of journalism. But only they will know the real answers.
Stilly Karalambush, thank you very much indeed. Co-founder, Chief Executive Officer of Daily Maverick.
Moneyweb at midday for all your up-to-date stories.
Now, I read the world has just 4 years left to meet its promise of protecting 30% of the ocean by 2030, but only about 3% is currently regarded as effectively protected. I'm going to talk now to Dr. Judy Mann-Lang, who's founder of MPA Day and executive for strategic projects at the Two Oceans Aquarium. She says governments must move beyond drawing boundaries on maps and ensure marine protected areas are properly managed and enforced. By the way, MPA Day is held every year. It's a global event dedicated to raising awareness about marine protected areas. Judy, a very warm welcome to you. Just over 3% of the ocean effectively protected. One's got to ask if that 30% target is realistically achievable.
30 by 30 was an amazing target, and 200 countries have said, yes, we want to make it happen. But in reality, with only 3.5% of the ocean really effectively protected and 10% in marine protected areas, the chances of us actually getting to 30 by 30 is very, very slim, unless there is a complete groundswell and change in both the designation of MPAs, that's implementing them or designating them first. Implementing them is the really hard part. So I don't think we're going to get there. I think it's been a good target to work towards. We're unlikely to get there, but I think we've got to keep the pressure on.
In layman's terms, Judy, what do we mean by effectively protected?
That's where we say turning a line on a map into something realistic. So it's really easy for a government to say, we're going to make this marine protected area. Here's the line on the map. This is now a protected area. And that's often one of the steps that needs to be taken. But then we actually need to get to effective enforcement and effective management of that land, that ocean area. So we need to look at having ranges in place. We need to have an element of funding. Funding's absolutely essential. So we need to make sure that in those protected areas, we actually are protecting the biodiversity and we're supporting the people around those protected areas. So we need a lot of community involvement. We need management plans. We need funding. We must stop things like bottom trawling actually happening in marine protected areas, which happens internationally. Luckily, not in South Africa. We're actually doing pretty well in that particular respect. But we need to actually start managing these areas and not just having them as paper parks.
And who independently decides whether an area is being effectively managed?
That's a very good question. And we don't have a big body that sort of looks over all the world's marine protected areas and says this is being effectively managed. But what we do look for things like, are there no-take zones, so areas that are fully protected? Is there appropriate management plans for a protected area? Is there funding for that protected area? Are there rangers working in the area? Are the community involved? So there are lots of things that we can look at to see if a protected area is actually being actively managed.
And that's fundamentally the problem, though, as to whether governments can credibly expand protection and reach those targets when we know so many existing areas are underfunded. You've raised the money question already, and simply bad monitoring, poor monitoring, or non-existent monitoring.
Monitoring is a critical thing because without monitoring, we can't see how effectively that protected area is working. So funding for research and monitoring is another really important thing, ensuring that we have scientists and fishermen actually involved in the monitoring so that they can see the benefit of those protected areas, because that's one of the big challenges is people say, oh my goodness, this protected area means that we're not going to benefit from the ocean. But in actual fact, protected areas help to benefit people. We have spillover. We have all sorts of benefits from these protected areas for fishermen fishing on either side of a protected area. And that's why we need to involve the fishermen in the monitoring as well. So it's not just for scientists. The fishermen need to be part of it as well so that they can see the positive benefits of these MPAs.
Judy, I'll take your point, but I'll push back. Difficult to convince fishing communities, surely, that protection will support livelihoods rather than remove them.
Yes, and that's something that we are challenged with around the world in protected areas. But where we are working with local communities around the whole world, where local communities are involved in working out the boundaries of the MPAs, working out what those MPAs are there to actually achieve, and where they're involved in both the management of the MPAs, the enforcement of the MPAs, and the monitoring, we're starting to see success. Where a protected area has been imposed and people have just been told, sorry, you can't fish here anymore, that's when we often have the most challenges. But where communities are involved from the bottom up right through the whole process is where we're starting to see really successful marine protected areas.
Having said that, is there enough empirical evidence that marine protected areas actually increase fish stocks?
Oh, yes. And that's something that we're starting to see more and more. Just here in South Africa, we've got an incredible research program around the coast looking at our coastal MPAs, and we have work done in and out of those protected areas. And we can see vast differences in the protected areas of numbers of fish, size of fish. The whole communities within the protected areas are natural. They're working as they should work. So we have a lot of evidence, and we're getting more and more evidence of the biological efficacy as well as the social impacts of MPAs. We're starting to explore those too now.
And Judy, just finally, against a backdrop of competing agendas, how do you think, or what should South Africa be doing differently over the next 4 years in order to partially meet that target, but to make a real and practical difference on the ground?
There are a few things that we should really look at. The first thing is taking responsibility for our marine protected areas and really realizing just how important they are for both human well-being as well as biodiversity. The next thing would be to allocate the funding, the staff, the resources, the capacity to manage those MPAs. The next thing would be really strong investment in communities around the MPAs and ensuring that they feel part of those MPAs, ensuring that every MPA has a proper management plan that's been developed for each one, both coastal and offshore, and implementing that MPA. And then looking at how we can use other effective conservation means to reach that 30 by 30 target. So 30 by 30 is an ambitious target, and I think that we can work towards that creatively by involving communities, involving the scientists, and making sure that the management authorities have the resources that they need to take responsibility for those protected areas.
And what about support from the corporate sector that either relies on this commercially or might have a bigger role to play altruistically?
I think that that's an area that we haven't even started to really look at, is how do we build the corporate sector into this? It's really for the corporate sector to start understanding just how much we rely on the ocean. And I think that that's a fundamental thing for all of us. The ocean produces half of the oxygen we breathe and absorbs 1/3 of the carbon we produce. I mean, just basic things like that. We need a healthy ocean for healthy life. And that is fundamental. So really working with the corporate sector, looking at what do they have to gain, what do they have to lose by not looking after the ocean, and then how can we work together more effectively. So I think that that's a critical area we need to really spend more time and energy on.
Dr. Judy Mann-Lang is Executive for Strategic Projects at the Two Oceans Aquarium. And that's where we are going to leave it for today. You've been listening to Moneyweb at midday. We are here every weekday at noon with the latest in current affairs, the economy and policy. You can always catch the podcast version a little later. Thank you for making us part of your day. Until next time, goodbye.
Listen to the daily live stream of Moneyweb at midday or download episodes on moneyweb.co.za, the Moneyweb app, Apple Podcasts and Spotify, or follow Moneyweb News on social media for more updates. Moneyweb, your trusted source for business and investment insights.